In this video, I'm going to talk a bit about act utilitarianism, which is a consequentialist theory that was first introduced or advanced by these two guys here, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. We can look at our chart, right, of ethical theories. So I said act utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. So if you've seen some of the previous videos, the intro video, you know, the consequentialist theories generally are kind of third-personal theories. They sort of take a God's eye view of the world, and say what would sort of produce the best consequences in these scenarios. We'll talk a little bit about consequentialism in a minute. But act utilitarians are a kind of consequentialist, and they endorse the following three views or principles. So one is just that consequentialism bit. So what is consequentialism? Consequentialism is the view that the moral permissibility of an action depends solely on its consequences. Remember, I said in a previous video that it's forward-looking, right? We don't care about what happened in the past. We only care about what's going to happen in the future. Another view that act utilitarians endorse is called hedonism. Hedonism is the view that pleasure or happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good, and that pain or sadness is the only thing that is intrinsically bad. So hedonists say, like, if a thing gets you pleasure, then it's, you know, good or instrumentally good towards that. If it gives you pain or sadness, well, then maybe it's bad. But if a thing sort of doesn't give you pain or pleasure, then it really isn't good or bad. Finally, there's the principle of impartiality. And that principle says, roughly, that pleasures and pains count equally no matter who it is that experiences them. So wherever pleasure shows up, it's good. Wherever pain shows up, it's bad. And it doesn't really matter who you are. Your pleasures and pains are equal. They count for the same. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. All right, so I'm going to go over each of those three parts again in a little bit more detail. So consequentialism as a theory sort of very broadly says that an action is morally permissible if and only if it will have better consequences than the alternatives. So what we're going to see in a minute here is we need to fill out what consequences are important, right? So act utilitarians have a particular view about which consequences matter. But there's some attractions just to like consequentialist views in general. And one thing that's attractive about them, right, is that we all accept that there are times when we can disregard rules against things like lying, stealing, and killing, right? That there might be exceptions, or maybe we shouldn't disregard the rules, but there are exceptions to the rules against lying, stealing, and killing. And consequentialism can explain why that is. So the thought is that, well, lying is generally wrong because it has bad consequences, but every once in a while, lying has good consequences, and in cases like that, you're allowed to do it. Same with stealing, same with killing. Following up on that, right? Consequentialism can explain when we can disregard those rules, right? I just sort of pointed that out, I think, a second ago, right? Which is that consequentialists don't only say that there are exceptions, but they can kind of like pick out when the exception works, right? So if a lie is really going to cause a lot of pain and suffering, then we think, okay, yeah, you can't do that. But if a lie actually produces a better outcome, then it looks like those are the kinds of cases when you can lie. So consequentialism can seem to explain when it is that we should disregard or where there are exceptions to those rules. Okay, so we want to know which consequences matter. So you can say, like, you got to have the best consequences, but if I don't know what consequences are good and what consequences are bad, then I don't really know how I should act. So the act utilitarians have a particular view about which consequences matter. And what they do is they endorse this view called hedonism. So hedonism says that pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically good, and pain is the only thing that is intrinsically bad. So when something produces pleasure, that thing is good, or maybe I should say that thing is instrumentally good for pleasure. And if something produces pain, then that thing is instrumentally bad because it produces pain, and pain is intrinsically bad. To see sort of, you know, how intrinsic and instrumental goods are different, think about like taking a class in philosophy. So the reason you might be taking the class, maybe you just like really enjoy taking philosophy, right? That would be if you get pleasure from it, we would think, oh, that's intrinsically good. Those classes are intrinsically good. But if you're like, I'm just taking a class in philosophy because I want to get um, all my credits for college, then I'd say, well, why do you want to do that? And then you'd say, well, I want to be able to get a job. They say, well, do you just like having a job? You say, no, no, of course not. Um, I don't want a job for its own sake. I want a job because it gets me money. And they say, okay, well, is money just good for its own sake? You say, no, no, no. Money is good because I can spend it on things. And then you say, okay, well, what are you going to spend it on? And then they say, well, I'm gonna have a house. You say, well, why is having a house valuable? Is it just good to have houses? No, no, having a house is valuable because it protects me from the rain, let's say, getting wet. Well, is being dry intrinsically valuable? No, no. The reason I want to stay dry is because if I get wet and cold, it just doesn't feel good. It's like unpleasant. And it's like, oh, boom, there, we've hit on the thing that explains sort of why you want to do all these other things, which is that you want to avoid pain. You think there's this unpleasant, painful experience of being wet and cold or something like that. Now, different people give different explanations for why they're doing all the things that they're doing. So, you watch a movie. Why do you do that? Well, it's pleasant. Why do you eat hamburgers and hot dogs? Well, because that gives you pleasure. Like there might be some nutrition, and you think you want to, you get hungry and there's a pain. Just by eating the food, you avoid that pain. That might be one reason. But you also sort of pick out foods that taste really good. Okay, so hedonism says sort of like knowledge, is that valuable? Only if it brings you pleasure. So somebody might think, no, it's good to have knowledge even if it doesn't bring you pleasure, but the hedonists don't think that. Okay. So one other point I want to make here is that hedonists can and should admit that there are at least two kinds of pleasures and pains, namely physical pleasures on the one hand, food, drugs, sex, etc., and attitudinal pleasures, right? Things that you are just excited about or happy that happen. So when like you eat pizza, like pizza isn't valuable, right? But the pleasure that you get from eating pizza is a physical pleasure. Same with like drinking alcohol, maybe. I mean, some people like it, some people don't. But if you're like, oh yes, I like the taste of this. That's maybe physical pleasure. Maybe if you have some sort of use drugs, have some euphoric state, it's a physical pleasure. As far as attitudinal pleasures go, right? Say the Cavaliers win the NBA championship, and you're a big Cavs fan. Well, then you don't have a physical pleasure. There's not like a physical sensation that goes along with that, but you have an attitudinal pleasure because you're like, oh yes, I'm very happy. Uh, I like knowing that the Cavs won or something. So it doesn't feel quite the same, but hedonists are gonna say, yeah, that counts as a pleasure as well. Okay. Finally, whose pleasures and pains matter? Earlier, I already sort of prompted you or gave you some sense that the act utilitarians are going to endorse what we might call the principle of impartiality. And that is whether you're male or female, black or white, gay or straight, big or small, able-bodied or disabled, rich or poor, human or non-human, right? It doesn't matter. Your pleasures and pains count equally. So utilitarians were often some of the first people fighting for gender equality, and women's rights. Utilitarians at the forefront, right, of anti-racist sort of movement. The LGBTQ community, support for people there, and animal rights as well. So when I say animal rights, I guess that's sort of dicey. So Peter Singer famously argued for like animal liberation, and his view was not that animals have rights per se, but rather that animals should their pleasures and pains matter equally. So if animals are suffering, then we should do something about that. All right. So given what we know, I want us to sort of evaluate some different worlds. So world one, It's a world where they're filled with happy people. World 2, filled with happy turtles. World 3 is empty. There's nothing there. I know it looks green. Maybe you think there's some grass growing there, but let's assume it's just spray painted. It's just dirt, spray painted green. And then 4, filled with sad people, and 5, filled with flowers. So no people, no animals, but a lot of flowers. Okay, now given what we know about act utilitarianism and sort of its commitment to consequentialism, hedonism, impartiality, we can ask ourselves, which of these worlds is the best world? And you should think about that, maybe pause, think, oh, how would I order these worlds? And when you're ready, you think you know how the act utilitarian would order them, unpause, and I'll explain. All right, so hopefully you're ready to go. You've got your answers. I think the best world for the act utilitarian is kind of a tie, maybe between 1 and 2. This is a little bit tricky, but assuming they're like the same number of humans and turtles, or I guess the real thing that matters is the amount of pleasure that they're experiencing similar. So maybe you think human pleasures, when humans are getting pleasure, it's sort of like more robust pleasure, or there's something like special about it in terms of its intensity or something like that. And if that's true, then maybe world 1 is a little bit better than 2. But assuming that the turtles are like really enjoying themselves and that people are really enjoying themselves, their enjoyment is the same and there's the same number, well, then those 2 worlds are going to be equally good according to the act utilitarian. What world is next best? Well, this is actually a tie between worlds 3 and 5. So in both of those worlds, there's no pleasure or pain, right? There are flowers in the one, which maybe like look nice or something, but flowers don't experience pleasure or they don't experience pain. And so it's just the same as a world that's completely empty. And then finally, we have world 4, right? That world is not neutral. It's actually positively bad. The fact that there are humans in it doesn't really count for anything. What matters is that those humans are all sad, and that's pain, and that makes it worse off than a world that's totally neutral. All right. So when we combine these 3 theories together, we get this view called act utilitarianism. And what act utilitarianism says is that an act is permissible if and only if it maximizes utility. So whatever our options are, we should do those things that produce the most happiness. So I think I explained that there right at the bottom. So what does it, you might say, well, what does it mean to maximize utility? An action maximizes utility when it produces at least as much net happiness as the alternatives. So we sort of add up the pleasure on the one side, we add up the pain on the other, we do the subtraction or whatever, do the math, and then we figure out, well, which one produces the most net happiness? So we'll look at some examples to get a handle on this. All right, so first, the famous example, the trolley problem, right? There's a train barreling down the tracks headed to hit 5 people. You are standing beside the train and you can flip a switch. And if you flip it, then the train will go over and hit that one person and miss the 5. And we might ask, well, what should we do here? And act utilitarianism gets us a pretty intuitive result. So in this case, which we might call switch, we can say, well, which of our options maximize utility? It seems like we could, on the one hand, flip the switch. In that scenario, the 5 live and they get pleasure in the future, but the one person dies, experiencing some pain, and he misses out on all that future pleasure. So what's bad about death for the utilitarian, it might be worth noting, right, is that it's not that it's so painful. What's bad about death is that you miss out on future pleasure. So we might think, okay, how do we evaluate this in terms of pleasure and pain? We can call like pleasure positive utils and pain negative utils. Some people call pleasure hedons and pain dolors, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, those 5 people who live, they get to experience pleasure in the future. Let's say 1,000 units per person. That person who dies is going to suffer, right? They're going to see that train coming at them. They might live a little bit after it hits them. They're going to be in pain for a little while. But the main sort of cost to that person isn't the pain, it's really the fact they miss out on the rest of their life. So we might say in this scenario, like relative to like all the people dying, right? This is positive. We still get 4,950. Not as good as if everybody lived, but we can't really achieve that. So it's not an open option for us. If we don't flip the switch, then one person is going to live and get the future pleasure, but 5 people are going to die, experiencing some pain, missing out on future pleasure. So same sort of thing, only there's only one person who lives, right, and gets the future pleasure, but now there are 5 people dying. So this is much less good, right? Much less pleasure in that world. So if we think, well, what should we do, or what are we obligated to do? The answer is we're obligated to flip the switch. We have to do it. To fail to flip the switch. If we don't, we've done something wrong, because flipping the switch produces more pleasure. What about this scenario? Getting punched in the face, right? So say students in my class think, you know what, I'd really love to punch Dr. Spellman in the face. And in fact, I'm going to do it during class time in front of everyone, and then everybody will get some pleasure out of seeing Dr. Spellman get punched. That's, obviously not me, but you can imagine. Okay, so we can ask, which of your options maximizes utility? If you beat me up, right, punch me in the face right in front of the class, let's say there are 20 people in the class, then you and your classmates are all going to get some pleasure, but I'm going to experience a lot of pain too. Not only maybe physical, but also attitudinal, like I'm embarrassed that I just got punched in the face. So let's say that each student who watches gets 20 units of pleasure, and then I get negative 100 units of pain. That leaves us with negative 60 units altogether. If you don't beat me up, then your classmates don't get any pleasure, but I don't get any pain, and so there's sort of no pleasure, no pain, and that's 0. And so then we ask, well, what should we do? We figure out what has the maximizes utility, and the answer here is not beating me up. Of course, you can see how the things might change, right? If students get more pleasure than I suggested in the first one, and my pain isn't quite so significant, then it actually makes sense. And the utilitarian might say, you actually have an obligation to punch me in the face in front of the class, because the amount of pleasure that students get is going to be large enough that it will justify the pain and suffering that I experience. Now, I realize maybe I should say here, I'm simplifying a little bit, right? So if you punch me in the face, then yeah, the classmates might enjoy it, and yeah, I might feel pain, but maybe I'm gonna like punish you somehow. Like I'm gonna give you an F for the class. Maybe you get expelled from school because you punched a teacher in the face. So maybe there's actually like you beating me up ends up just the pain to me isn't the only factor, right? There's also this harm that comes to you. You miss out on a college education. You turn out not to be able to get a good job. Your kids and family suffers. I mean, there could be more stuff going on here. So I've kind of oversimplified things. But if we really wanted to do a full analysis, right, we'd have to sort of consider all the factors. All right, one last case. In this case, we're going to consider whether or not we should eat breakfast. So what are our options? Let's say we've got a few options here. So the first option, you don't eat any breakfast. In this case, you'll save some money, right? And you can use that money later, but you'll be hungry before lunch. Well, I realize maybe you eat at Mac or you have like meal swipes, and so maybe not eating breakfast doesn't actually save you any money. But let's assume that it does, right? So if you're going to eat breakfast, you got to pay for it. If you don't eat breakfast, you're going to save some money, which you can use later to buy something you like, but you're going to be hungry. In this case, you get 2 utils from using the money later, but you also lose 2 from being hungry. Maybe this balances out, right? Maybe it doesn't quite balance out. Maybe the thing you buy later is worth the hunger, or maybe not quite. But let's just assume that it balances out. Alternatively, you could eat Cheerios for breakfast. You're not going to save the money, right? So you can't spend that money later, but you do enjoy eating the Cheerios, and you're not going to be hungry before lunch. So let's say you get 2 utils there from eating the Cheerios, but you don't lose any for being hungry. That's +2. And then finally, you could eat Fruit Loops. If you eat Fruit Loops, you won't save any money, but eating the Fruit Loops will be very pleasant and you won't be hungry before lunch. So in this case, let's say eating the Fruit Loops is +4 utils and there's no hunger. So in this case, the total is +4. Now in this case, what utilitarianism says might be like a little strange because it looks like utilitarianism says not only is eating Fruit Loops a good thing, but it's morally obligatory. You have to do it. And that seems a bit strange. Do I really have to maximize utility in my own case all the time? The theory maybe starts to seem a little bit too demanding. So that's one objection to utilitarianism, like one reason why we might be a little skeptical of it. There are other objections to utilitarianism, but we can talk about those later. To review, right, act utilitarianism, what does it say? What's the theory say? The theory says this: an action is morally permissible if and only if it maximizes utility. And we might ask, well, how do we apply this theory? Here's how you apply it. Step 1, look at what actions are available to you. What actions are available to the agent? What can they do? What are their options? 2, what are the likely outcomes of those actions? So what's probably going to happen if you do those actions? Now we can get like really complicated and look at the what's called the expected utility of actions. But for our purposes right now, this rough description is good enough. So we just want to think, what's likely to happen if I do that? What's the sort of, what are the results going to be? What's the world going to look like when I do that action? Then 3, what I want to figure out is how much net happiness are those outcomes going to produce? So when I have a sense for the outcomes, I need to sort of do the math, right? Like we did in those examples. How much pleasure does this produce? How much pain does it produce? Let's total those things up. And then finally, 4, the 4 is covered up by my picture, sorry about that. Which action is most likely to produce the most net happiness? So we need to figure out which of the actions that are available is the one that's most likely to produce the most net happiness. And that's that. Then we've applied the theory. All right, that's all for this video. Hopefully that's giving you a good background on what act utilitarianism is, and yeah, we'll end there.